to EPG's first 2023 podcast. We are here today with Luciana, the head of the Clean Economy program of EPG, to talk about industrial decarbonization, especially in the Romanian context. It's a topic that we are going to cover increasingly more with a lot of exciting projects this year. And we've just kicked it off at the end of 2022 with a high-level meeting with a report that Luciana is still coordinating. We're going to get to the details of that in a second. But before we do that, I thought it'd be a good chance to ask you why we are discussing industrial decarbonization. Why is it a topic that's gaining increasingly more prominence in the European space, in the Romanian space? Why is it important?
Thank you. That's a great question to kick us off. So, industry has traditionally been a little bit less in the spotlight than energy, which is responsible for the bulk of emissions, not just in the EU, but worldwide. But it's been gaining an increasing amount of attention as we move towards more and more ambitious emissions reduction targets, not least because emissions from the energy consumption of industry, but also the emissions that directly come from industrial processes themselves are an increasingly high share of European and global emissions as the energy sector itself decarbonizes, particularly the power sector. So we're really talking about some sectors of the economy that will continue having emissions right up until 2050, some of them very hard, if not impossible to abate. And that's the reason that we're starting to talk about industrial decarbonization, looking at new processes, more technologies. This has started becoming quite obvious at EU level. We've recently had an announcement on the Green Deal Industrial Plan, which really pinpoints the directions for decarbonizing Europe's industry. So we have these sort of macro trends and policy push that are kind of driving forward the agenda for industry decarbonization. And in Romania in particular, the reason why it's important to start talking about this is, number one, it's not really part of the discussion at the moment. And number two, industry still contributes more to Romania's economy and emissions than the EU average. So since the end of the communist regime, Romania has been on a gradual trend for deindustrialization, but the value added of industry and the emissions that it generates are still more prominent than the EU average. So it's high time to start talking about it in Romania.
No, absolutely. And as you said, basically we're talking both about the emissions related to energy consumption, energy use, but also to process emissions, which are inevitable, which happen simply because of the chemistry behind producing cement, or basic chemicals and so on, which they tend to be like stickier emissions. They're more difficult to decarbonize.
Absolutely,
right?
Yeah. And a great example is the cement industry, indeed, where the chemical process of converting the rock, the limestone that's used as a raw material, to clinker, which is the precursor to cement, the chemical reaction causes the release of CO2. And there is some space for substituting materials and creating composite cements where you substitute some of the clinker for other materials, but that potential is quite limited. And cement and the product that comes out of it, concrete, are incredibly important products. So concrete is the second most used product by volume in the world after water. And it's such an integral part of infrastructure development. And this is, again, something to highlight. Countries like Romania, which are putting a lot of effort and investment towards developing their infrastructure, are going to be big users of industrial products like cement, like steel, and so on. So the conversation also shifts towards the demand for these products and how that can drive decarbonization. I'm sure we'll get to that later, but it's worth pointing out. Yeah.
No, of course. And while we can take measures to reduce demand in the economy that's still developing and infrastructure is still underdeveloped, consumption is going to increase, and I think that's also a global trend, not just a Romanian trend, indeed. So that's very interesting, and I think that's a very important point to kind of repeat, which is you can get electricity production without CO2 emissions, but you cannot get, for example, cement production without it. There are certain industrial processes which, of course, you can have alternatives that have fewer CO2 emissions, usually not completely zero. But yeah, cement is one of the more difficult nuts to crack. Just before we get to the Romanian context, I think it's probably it'd be good to discuss what's been happening with the Fit for 55 package as well, and with the revision of the ETS, because free allocation is going to be eliminated for industry. Basically, industry has been receiving its CO2 permits for free for the past decade and a half, which is not going to be the case anymore. So what do you think? How do you think that changes the dynamics in terms of industrial decarbonization, what we've seen so far, which has been a rather slow move towards new technologies, and how transformative do you think this change is going to be?
Well, I think it has the potential to be very transformative because so far the ETS hasn't really sent the correct signals for decarbonization in these industries. And this was partly to do with the price of CO2 and how it reached very low levels. And it's only really in the past couple of years that it's picked up and it's reached record levels. I think it's around 100 euros per ton at the moment. So that's on the one hand. And on the other hand is indeed these free CO2 allowances that have been given to industries that are considered to be at risk of carbon leakage, which basically means these industries moving their production outside of the EU carbon market so that they don't have to pay for emission certificates. And now, with the price where it is and with free allowances being phased out, this is starting to send the correct signals. This is where it starts to become a business decision to implement emission reduction technologies to avoid paying for CO2 certificates. And we are getting to the point where even expensive emission reductions technology like carbon capture are starting to look economically viable because the price of CO2 is so high and because the alternative of, free allowances basically isn't there anymore. So I do think it has the potential to be transformative. I think like any stick approach, it needs to be complemented with a carrot approach. So it's quite important for the EU and member states to have the mechanisms in place that enable, not just financially, but also from a regulatory perspective, industry to really invest and get these emission reduction technologies implemented, because some of them, like for example carbon capture and storage and hydrogen, they're capital intensive, they're infrastructure intensive, and here the state really has a big role to play. So we're placing these increasing expectations on industry, which is the key to decarbonizing, but also the solutions need to be accessible by those industrial operators. And we see that there is appetite, but in Romania, we also see increasing calls for government involvement to facilitate actually installing these technologies.
No, I think you're spot on, and I think there is also a risk to this newly transformative role that ETS can have for industry across Europe. And that's now that we're facing a relatively fast elimination of free allocation, industries are going to be exposed to those CO2 prices. We are moving into that space which you mentioned, between 100 and 200 euros per ton of CO2, which is where about most industries have their sort of break-even cost for moving towards cleaner technologies and solutions. But the risk is that now, if the governments don't do their job, there will be a chaotic exit of some industries from the European and the Romanian market. And I think that's maybe a good leeway for us to discuss the emitters here in Romania. So I know you've been working with some EPG colleagues on a study on Romanian industry. So how does it look like? What are the biggest industrial emitters, the biggest sectors in Romania from this perspective?
Yeah, so in this study, we zoomed in on 3 sectors. There's others that are similarly important, which I'll mention as well, but the in-depth work that we've done has been on steel, on chemicals, and on cement. So the absolute largest emitter in Romania, and this includes energy producers as well, which we haven't looked at, is Liberty Steel, the steel plant in Galați. Now, this is the only steel plant in Romania that uses blast furnace at the moment. We have about 5 other steel producers that use electric arc furnaces, which have much lower emissions. They use scrap steel as an input rather than iron ore. But Liberty's emissions in the most recent year we have data for, which was 2021, was 4.4 million tons of CO2 equivalent in the EU ETS. And obviously a lot of this comes from the fact that they use coal in the iron making process, and the size of the plant itself, which produced about 2.5 million tons of liquid steel in the most recent year we have data for, 2020, I believe. This is nowhere near the emissions and the production in 1990, by the way. So this is something worth noting, that Romania's deindustrialization trend since 1990 has been accompanied by the gradual reduction of production capacities and, as a result, emissions, which speaks to the fact that you were talking about a chaotic exit in view of, production potentially becoming uneconomical. I think that's something that we do need to look at in light of what we've seen since 1990. So that's Liberty. It's an important employer as well. It employs about 5,000 people, and it's situated in the just transition region of Galați, meaning that it's in a region which is going to be the recipient of EU funding for avoiding social impact on workers and communities that are affected by the transition away from carbon-intensive industries.
But it's important here to also highlight a bit that they cannot get away from these emission-intensive production process just yet, because what they're also making is primary steel, which is steel from iron ore. So could you walk us a bit through the difference between what most producers of electric arc furnaces do and what Liberty does, and why do we need primary steel production still?
So why is it so important in terms of Romania's steel production that Liberty transitions and still produces primary steel? Well, like I mentioned, we have 5 electric arc furnaces using scrap steel. Now, Romania in 2021 produced about 3.5 million tons of scrap. So that is just, scrap steel, ferroalloys, and so on that can be processed in electric arc furnaces. And that is not enough scrap to produce as much steel as Romania is producing, whether it's through electric arc furnaces or blast furnaces. So we still need to be able to produce primary steel, for which we need to be able to process iron ore into liquid steel. Now, the blast furnace process, which is the traditional way of doing this, is incredibly emissions intensive. Like we were talking about earlier, it uses a lot of coal. So the idea is to transition away from the process itself, but still keep using iron ore and producing primary steel from which you can then make steel products. And the way Liberty is going about this is that they are planning to switch to a process called direct reduction of iron, which uses a different type of iron ore, and that's going to be an interesting thing to look at in terms of the supply of raw materials, but it can use either natural gas or hydrogen as a reducing agent rather than coal. So the emissions intensity of the process drops actually about 90 to 95%. And this DRI, direct reduced iron module, can then be connected to an electric arc furnace for further processing of the intermediary iron product, which is called sponge iron. So it's a different process, and it can be done with natural gas, which is still a fossil fuel. I know Liberty is planning to transition directly to using green hydrogen, but again, it's very capital intensive, it's very emissions intensive, and also an interesting thing to look at from a resource point of view is that moving towards electric arc furnaces also means that Liberty's demand for scrap steel is going to go up. So we don't just talk about emissions and energy here, and this is something we're trying to highlight in our study. We also talk about raw materials inputs. So Liberty at the moment still uses a bit of scrap steel. They produce most of it through the blast furnace, but they do add some scrap steel into their processing. It's about 350,000 tons per year. They've projected that with their current plans to transition towards electric arc furnaces, their demand would go up to 1.4 million tons of scrap steel by 2030. And we've done some calculations showing that if this goes through, and we've also got 2 other steel producers that we're expecting to increase their production in the coming years. Romania, which is now a net exporter of scrap steel, we exported about 1.3 million tons last year, would become a net importer of scrap steel. We need to import about 300,000 tons. So this is something worth looking at as well. Really having a holistic perspective on what these transformation plans will mean, not just for the facility itself, but for the industry as a whole. So if demand for scrap really goes up that high, how are steel facilities in Romania going to compete for that scrap? And are some going to be left behind? Are some going to have to adjust? So I think that's an interesting point to raise as well. I know we're still just talking about Liberty, and there's plenty of other industrial producers, but it's a really interesting case here because they have a big transition ahead of them. It's going to be a big process. So yeah.
No, absolutely, and it's generally a global problem as well, which is scrap availability and how much we're going to be able to actually achieve with this. So steel will be a combination of increased electrification and decarbonization of electricity use in electric arc furnaces and use of hydrogen as the preferable reduction agent to replace coal. probably a bit less retrofitting blast furnaces with carbon capture and storage here in
Yeah.
Europe. That's probably more applicable to facilities in India, China,
Yeah.
that are newer in general, because we are speaking of a very old facility here at Liberty.
Yeah.
But you mentioned two more sectors. Let's look at them in turn as well. Cement.
Yeah, so cement is a big emitter as well as a sector overall. It's gone through a similar trend of reducing production and was hit around the financial crisis as well. It's rebounded a bit since then, but production levels right now are about half than they were in 1990. Still, as we were mentioning earlier, cement has the big problem of process emissions. So cement producers in Romania, we currently have 7 plants where clinker and then cement are produced, which are these sort of big emitters. They're owned by 3 multinational conglomerates. We've got Heidelberg Cement, who are known internationally as Heidelberg Materials, Holcim, and CRH, which in Romania are Romcim. So they operate these clinker plants, and when it comes to the sort of incremental improvements in emissions reductions, a lot has already been done. Even by 1990, most of these production plants had switched from wet kiln to dry kiln operations, which is a huge improvement from energy consumption point of view. They all co-incinerate waste. So rather than using fossil fuels to generate the heat needed for production, they substitute some of those fossil fuels with waste. And there has been some controversy around importing waste and the quality of that waste that's being burned in these cement plants. But overall, all of the plants burn at least some amount of waste, and some of them recover waste heat as well. At the Holcim plant in Alej, this was the first cement plant in Romania that started recovering its waste heat. But there's only so far that these cement plants can go in terms of emissions reductions, and they are starting to look towards carbon capture as a solution for decarbonizing, which is, like with any big industrial operator from these sectors, the investment cycles are quite long. So the windows of opportunity that are still available before 2050 to retrofit something like carbon capture, they're getting increasingly less. So we're having fewer and fewer of them. And with cement, also one thing to consider for carbon capture is that it adds on to their energy consumption. So here it also raises the question of where that energy is coming from and what's its carbon intensity, but also what with energy prices, is that going to be manageable for cement producers? So that's the cement sector.
No, and it's interesting because there are 7 clinker producers in Romania. It's a relatively large industry here as well. And as opposed to what was the case for steel, we're not speaking about those transformative solutions just yet. We're not anywhere close to a commercially viable alternative to cement production for the classical Portland cement route that we're currently doing. So obviously, retrofitting with CCS is important. I think it was great that you mentioned the energy penalty that comes with this, which increases costs. So it's not just an added capital cost for the cement producer, but it's also an operational cost that's going to be added on top of that. Let's see how they're going to manage to handle that. But I know there's a project already in the region, not in Romania, that is looking at CCS within the short-term, medium-term horizon.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first innovation fund project in Southeastern Europe is in Bulgaria, and it's a project called ANRAV CCS, which is proposing to capture CO2 emissions from a cement plant in Mihnea. It actually belongs to the Heidelberg Cement Group. And then transporting it and storing it offshore in a depleted gas field called the Galata gas field. Funny story, it has been confused with the Galați field, which is in Romania, which did trigger some confusion about, is somebody storing CO2 in Romania without us knowing about it? But it is in the Bulgarian territorial waters. So that is getting going. It is very interesting to follow this project because we're not just talking about technologies here anymore as much as we're talking about institutional capacity to actually deliver the regulation, for example, the permitting that's needed to actually operate these storage sites. This is a subject that hasn't really been touched practically in Bulgaria before. And in Romania, not since 2010 when we had an attempt at a carbon capture and storage demonstrator project. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done around enabling legislation, monitoring and verification of storage sites, for example, to make sure that these projects actually deliver the emissions reductions they need. So it'll be interesting to look at what happens in the Bulgaria project because we see a lot of similarities with the Romanian case, and there's a lot that we can learn from it.
No, absolutely, and it's probably an example of a company moving faster than the government where it's operating.
Yeah.
All right. Last but not least, you mentioned chemicals. I think here it's also interesting in terms of what's been happening in the last 30 years in Romania and like how the sector has evolved. And then we can get to talk a bit about what they're trying to do to reduce emissions.
Yeah, absolutely. So Romania has historically had an important fertilizer production sector. So as far as chemicals go, today the largest emitter from the chemical sector and also the second largest industrial emitter after Liberty is a company called Azomureș, and they have a nitrogen-based fertilizer production plant in the Mureș County of Transylvania, which is also a just transition region, which we can come back to a bit later in terms of their plans. So Azomureș have been around for a long time. Their CO2 emissions are also, we can also call them hard to abate because a lot of them come from the directly from the production process of ammonia, which is the precursor to nitrogen-based fertilizers, and traditionally is produced by the reforming of natural gas, which emits CO2 from the actual process. So they are in a similar position to cement and steel in terms of their process emissions and their need to decarbonize. But alongside Azomureș, we also had a series of other fertilizer production plants that have since closed. And the reason behind this has been quite a lot to do with energy prices. They're huge consumers of natural gas. So Azomureș is by far the largest consumer of natural gas in Romania. The fertilizer plants consume natural gas also for heat production for their processes, but also as the raw material to make ammonia. So they've been really affected by natural gas prices, especially recently. But this stretches back to the last decade or so when we've seen, I think, 3 or 4 of the major fertilizer producers in Romania close their operations. So right now it's pretty much Azomureș that is left as the main producer. Aside from that, we also have some important producers of bulk chemicals. We've got Chimcomplex. So they have 2 production facilities, one larger one in the sort of south of Romania and one in Moldova in the northeast. And their production processes generally start with the electrolysis of brine, so basically salt water. So they also have hydrogen production capabilities, and they've shown a lot of interest in this as part of their very wide portfolio of chemical products. They're also looking to become, the next biggest hydrogen producers in Romania, if not in the region. So they're also significant emitters. They also do consume energy and water and a significant amount of raw materials in the form of brine mostly. And they are the second largest chemicals producer after Azomureș. So right now, I believe Romania has only one operational producer of soda ash, Czech Soda, who had to suspend their operations in recent years, again, because of issues with their energy, more precisely steam supply. But they are looking to actually build their own steam production facility on site to resolve these issues and resume operations. So we may see them come back online with their adjacent emissions in the near future.
All right, so huge history of chemical production, also petrochemical production in Romania, mostly because of the rich oil and gas history that Romania has had. I think first refiner of petroleum in Europe at least. And these industries have faced relative decline over the past few decades. And now, especially with the very high natural gas prices, they are facing significant difficulties. So you mentioned a bit that they are producing hydrogen. A lot of it is going to be hydrogen again, as it's been for steel. So to produce green methanol, green ammonia, we're again looking at hydrogen. But very quickly, I thought it would be worth looking at the other side of what sometimes treated as a different sector, the petchems, where naphtha production is responsible for a lot of the CO2 emissions that they have. But Romania has a strong oil refining sector as well, right?
Yeah, definitely. So oil refining is still strong. One of the largest emitters in Romania. Just to mention that in our study, we didn't directly look at petroleum refining. but it's definitely a sector worth investigating more in depth. So the largest emitter from petroleum refining is the Petrobras refinery, which is owned by OMV Petrom, and they have come out with sort of strategy to 2030 of really starting to produce more sort of green products, looking towards e-fuels. So decarbonization plans seem to be anchored both in the idea of substituting their inputs for less carbon intensive ones, but also in creating new business lines, for example, investing in new fuels and new types of products, and also carbon capture and storage, because aside from their refinery business, they're also an oil and gas operator, and they have depleted oil and gas fields that they can look at storing CO2 in. But yes, the petroleum refining sector still remains an important sector in Romania, and there is definitely a lot of interesting climate mitigation technologies that can be taken up by it.
All right. So what I hear so far, besides some demand reduction that you mentioned in terms of technology, industrial transformation in those main industrial emitters from Romania, cement, steel, chemicals, and petrochemicals, revolves around electrification, hydrogen, and carbon capture and storage, which brings us to the barriers that those industries are currently facing in implementing any decarbonization plans. So we discussed that the ETS context is changing. They are going to be exposed to a CO2 price. But you mentioned towards the beginning the lack of infrastructure that may be needed for some of these technological solutions. So what are the main barriers that they are facing right now?
Yeah, so I would start with the highest level barrier here and then maybe zoom in a bit on the infrastructure question, which is the political commitment to industrial decarbonization. And I think this is not a problem that's necessarily unique to Romania, but it is felt particularly strongly in Romania because, again, of the contribution that industry brings to the economy and emissions. So there is no roadmap to decarbonize Romania's industry at the moment. There's no coherent plan. We see industrial operators coming forward with plans and requests for funding for various technologies, for various projects. It's all quite fragmented. There's nothing really bringing it together. There's no targets that have been set. There is no clarity in terms of institutional responsibility, and that I think is the biggest barrier. That's the thing that needs to get solved before we can start talking about, actually bringing specific technologies in. Now, on the infrastructure question, like you said, the three main directions that we see are electrification, hydrogen, and carbon capture and storage. And all of these do need investments in infrastructure. For electrification, we are in serious need of modernization of Romania's grid to be able to support an increased demand for electricity from producers like Liberty that are switching over, they're converting their technology to electricity based, but also to integrate new renewable energy projects that are starting to come online, as Romania is quite attractive in terms of its potential for solar, for wind, and so on. So that's the infrastructure question on electrification. And hydrogen and carbon capture are similar. They need extensive transport infrastructure and storage infrastructure, and these cannot be done by private operators alone. In most countries where they've been deployed successfully, there has been state involvement. You see Norway, that's the most advanced one in terms of CCS, has very strong government support and involvement in delivering carbon capture and storage projects. I know Romania is due to come out with a hydrogen strategy soon, which will be very interesting to see, because that might just help give that certainty in terms of developing the hydrogen infrastructure, and hopefully at some point also a carbon capture and storage one, because again, the state involvement in building out this large-scale infrastructure, which doesn't really make sense at a very small scale from an economics point of view, that's going to be crucial. So they go hand in hand, I think, the political commitment and the need for infrastructure when it comes to industry decarbonization.
All right. So what I take from what you've just said is that on one hand, there's the high-level political commitment, which has been missing, and the planning, both at industrial level but also at sector level. It's great to hear that the hydrogen strategy is going to come out, but it's just one piece of the greater puzzle. And then there's also the infrastructure side for grids, electricity grids, for hydrogen production and transportation, for CO2 transportation and storage, where we actually need to get more practical. It's probably long overdue that we don't discuss this just in terms of planning, but we actually need to fix the missing regulation, or to actually start building these projects. You mentioned quite a lot the territorial just transition plans, and what's interesting, I think, particularly in Romania, is that there's 5 transition regions, and 3 out of 5 they're actually because of the industrial sector that's present in the area, not necessarily of coal. Because people traditionally think of these sort of regions of being coal intensive, but it's not necessarily just the case. So there can be some funds that can be leveraged for the JTF, but are they enough? And not just for this, but more generally, does Romanian industry have access to sufficient financing for going through these transformative changes that we've been talking about?
That's a great question. And I think it's worth pointing out that the Just Transition funding is primarily for reskilling, upskilling, offering compensation to the workers and the communities that are left behind in the transition. So a small part of it, I think, can be accessed by industrial operators. This really varies by country, by the way. Like in Croatia, Just Transition funding has gone to a cement plant to install carbon capture. So it does vary. In Romania, as far as I know, a small part of the Galați funding from the Just Transition, for example, would go directly to Liberty. Similarly, I think in Mureș, the funding that's accessible is more for sort of pilot scale projects and so on. So I think that Just Transition can unlock funding for sure, but I think for that there needs to be, again, that sort of political commitment to making this happening, because Just Transition funding, it isn't just a sort of non-reimbursable funding that goes directly to member states. There's also a public loan facility, and there's also opportunities through the European Investment Bank to really unlock private financing. And so that's a way in for operators and for industrial decarbonization, but that needs to be explored. I think one important funding strand also to explore is the use of EU ETS revenues, which is something that member states manage themselves. And I know that there are guidelines on a certain percentage of the revenue that needs to go towards, climate change mitigation. I think that can be made clearer, and it can be even ring-fenced a bit more so that the revenues, which are going up because the price of certificates is going up, actually do contribute towards decarbonization. I think that's a good way to introduce, the carrot into this whole carrot and stick that is the ETS. So that is something that can be done at member state level. So that's worth exploring. And finally, the Innovation Fund, which has traditionally been focused on, as the name says, innovation, and mostly taken up by countries in Western Europe, where research and development and innovation is higher than in Eastern Europe. Now I think there's a view of trying to sort of relax that aspect a little bit and move towards more a sort of a net zero fund rather than an innovation fund, where the innovation component isn't necessarily that central, so that countries from this part of Europe can also access it for implementing relatively mature technologies, but in new settings, and trying to overcome novel challenges in some respect. So that'll be another funding stream that needs to be looked at. I know the application process is quite complicated and quite time consuming, and it needs to be underpinned by very, very good knowledge and information. So for example, if we would want to use the Innovation Fund to draw funding for a carbon capture and storage project, that really needs to be underpinned with very good prospecting of storage sites and a very good rationale for the captured CO2, the sort of climate impact that would actually have. So those are, I think, three major sources of funding that I can think of. Just Transition, the funding that it unlocks, the EU ETS revenues, and the Innovation Fund.
Yes, but in a way, it's also worth mentioning that I don't think that it's comparable in a way to what Western member states are mobilizing for their own industries. We've seen quite a lot of what's been happening with the state aid for COVID now in the wake of the war in Ukraine. And I think there's a real danger here that if state aid gets to be instrumentalized increasingly more for funding industrial decarbonization, small countries like those in Eastern Europe are going to suffer. So in a way, I think governments, not just in Romania, but in the region as a whole, need to start being a bit more creative about how to actually fund industries.
Yeah, I think I agree. I do think that it also needs to start with a solid baseline, because these funds that we've been mentioning, the revenue sources, they've been around for a while, and yet their contribution to decarbonizing Romania's industry has been pretty much negligible as far as I can see. So I agree. We absolutely need to get more creative. We need to avoid giving lump sums of money to avoid closure of plants that are not in keeping with the transition to a low carbon economy. That's something that Romania does suffer from in terms of its funding decisions. But at the same time, we do need to draw on these existing sources of funding as well, to avoid just, pushing the ball down the line. We'll wait until we come up with a creative financing mechanism, and then we'll start talking about it. No, there's funding available. We need to start talking about it now, and also planning for the future. What happens when the Just Transition funding has run out, or
All right. Yeah. Thanks a lot for this tour de force of three of the main sectors that emit greenhouse gas emissions here in Romania, talking about some of the solutions. We spoke about hydrogen, electrification, carbon capture and storage, also about financing, about the need for planning. A lot of work to be done, and
which is great for us at EPG.
Precisely, and that's why I wanted to wrap things up a bit, just to give us a bit of an idea of the work you're going to be coordinating for the next couple of years on industrial decarbonization here in EPG, and what sort of areas you're going to look at.
Sure. So we've started off with a study that you were mentioning, which we haven't talked about. The big part of it is building a database of industrial emitters. So this is something that we think is quite key. It's very difficult to find centralized, high-quality information on the emissions and resource consumption data around industrial emitters in Romania. So we are going to be continuing that project and building it up and hopefully making it a useful tool that can be used not just by us, but by other organizations interested in analyzing Romania's industry. So that's number one. Number two, we're going to be diving a bit deeper into the steel sector. So we are kicking off a project that's looking at the decarbonization of Romania's steel industry. And alongside that, starting to look also into another gap that I don't think we addressed, which is stakeholder coordination on industrial decarbonization. So we're going to be really trying to create momentum within the energy intensive industry in Romania by bringing stakeholders together to discuss these big directions that we were talking about for decarbonization together. And we're going to be looking at a specific sort of solution as well. It's less about the technology, more about demand management. So we're going to be looking at green public procurement. So this is a concept, if you will, whereby the buyer actually drives the demand for low carbon products by taking up either voluntary or mandatory standards for the products to meet certain green criteria. And this is again a topic that hasn't been explored almost at all in Romania, so we're going to be seeing what the appetite is for it, focusing particularly on intermediate products like steel and cement, which again are important products for Romania as it looks towards further developing its infrastructure. So how can those big public buyers drive demand for low carbon products, thereby supporting those industries to implement the solutions necessary to get those low carbon products on the market? So those are a couple of the directions, but just overall, I think it's a really exciting journey that we're on. It's a new area, it's untapped, and I think there's a lot we can do.
Absolutely, and I'm sure we'll have more conversations of this sort, even more in-depth than we've had today over the next couple of years as these projects progress. Luciana, thank you very much for this conversation, and I look forward to talking about industrial decarbonization again in the future.
Same here, thank you.